Morning, good evening for all of you in attendance. If you're at home or here at your office or live here in our event, my name is Cassiano Ribeiro. I'll be the moderator for this panel. We have here Mariane Crespolini as Director of the Ministry of Agriculture, Livestock and Food Supply, rural producer as well. Then we have Lyra, Glaucia Mendes de Souza, Professor of BIOEN FAPESP, Universidade de São Paulo. She's with us remotely, and if you can watch us online, you will be able to watch her on your screens. And our last panelist is Lyra, Senior Director, Energy Innovation, Sumitomo Corporation, directly from New York. I thank you, Mark, for being here with us. Did you have a good trip? Okay, thank you. So we'll start. We have 25 minutes for each panelist to do their presentation. We'll start with Mariane, and then we'll follow with Glaucia remotely, and finally Mark will give his presentation. So we're going to talk about carbon emission neutralization. Mariane, the floor is yours. I think let's start. We'll just need the Mariane's presentation. Okay, here's the first slide. Well, everyone, good afternoon. I'd like to first congratulate my friends here, Mark, Graciani, a lot of friends that I've seen here in these events, a lot of partners. And I would like to start thanking Data Agro and Monique for the organization of this event and talk a little bit. Of course, Cassiano mentioned I was for 3.5 years in the Ministry of Agriculture. Minister Teresa Cristina gave me a big challenge, which is to review the ABC plan, which is one of the main policies for the reduction of GHG gases in agriculture. And for my whole career as a master's and a doctorate, I studied the transformations that agriculture has been going through, and how we've been discussing this, Cassiano, how can we speed up this transformation? So how can we reach this net zero carbon emissions even faster? With some history, Brazil is a great exporter of food stuff, but in the 70s and 80s, Brazil imported essential foods. So I like this picture. We imported beans. If you're from abroad, you don't know that rice and beans is the basic food of Brazilians. And we imported some of these foods. And what made this change, and what is the learnings that we have to achieve this net zero that we're talking? Everything depends on technology, investment, and innovation. I could talk about many institutions here, but this is the creation of Embrapa. So our agriculture really had a leap with this innovation and technology and research. Just a little bit of figures. Our production of grains for each hectare that we planted, we had 1 ton of grain harvested. Now this proportion is almost 4 to 1, and this is the most beautiful chart to talk about this future. My father used to say that the off-season corn. Now the off-season second harvest corn represents 70% of our production. So the first harvest we can see in blue was 20% beginning of 2020. Now we're talking about 70%, and we can see some yellow there, which is the third harvest. So what made it happen? Research. Not only genetic improvement and development of new productive systems, irrigated agriculture, more sustainable production systems, and more resilient production systems. I'm going to talk about direct cultivation, which is the best way to sequestering carbon from the soil and allows our production to resist more without rain. And here I like to show this chart here in Brazil, how we're able to increase this planted area, the cultivated area. It's 70 million hectares, but we need to remember that this is the planted area. There are more than 20 million hectares that we're going to have 1, 2, or maybe 3 harvests. So we plant soybeans in the beginning of October when we have the start of the rain season in Brazil. I love this picture because it shows the straw in the middle of the soybeans here, which is this is what sequesters the carbon. This is what maintains the organic matter in the soil and maintains the soil humid for a longer time. That's the advantage of our tropical agriculture. So we plant the corn together with the pastures. You can see how many hours of work we have of our scientists, so that when we harvest the corn, we have a pasture that is growing exuberantly. And you can see here it's growing. I'll show some picture that I took 2 years ago. It was July 26, 2 years ago. And then we include the pastures. So you can see here in São Paulo we have a dry weather. Our gardens are dying, but we can have these pastures in our dry season without irrigation. This is a technology for tropical agriculture which sequester carbon and promote a more resilient livestock production. We have moments of big challenges. This is the prices of the food baskets. They dropped comparing the 70s until 2020. I talked to him. We need to update this chart. And now what we've seen is a rise in prices worldwide, and the Economist is forecasting the situation regarding food security in Brazil and all over the world. And in this context, we have a great public policy, which is the ABC plan. The first phase started in 2010. I love to talk about the subject. You're passionate about the subject, right? Yeah, I'm super passionate about it because this plan is an example of it's not a government policy, it's a state policy. It started in 2010. It was reviewed in 2020 and increased. The technology increased, involvement of more researchers, and the ambitions also increased. This was the first phase. 6 technologies were incentivized. We are talking about Assad. He was a big name in the creation of this plan, together with other researchers. And in 2010, Brazil said, okay, we're going to recover 35 million hectares, which is approximately the size of Germany. And the results were 52 million hectares. When I joined the government in 2019, and I said, well, where are these areas? And then Laerte from the Federal University of Goiás, they mapped this and showed where are these recovered areas. So this 2010, these areas in green were pastures that were severely degraded. In 2018, when they measured for the last time, there was a recovery of 27 million hectares. My last slides and the provocation that I had with Cassiano, what do we need to do to speed it up? Of this 27 million hectares, only 4 million were financed by the ABC program within the Safra program. And what else has been financed by other resources, or what is happening in Brazil? The producers' own capital, because it improves profitability. So ABC was transformed to ABC Plus. More than 50 institutions and 600 researchers were involved. So ABC Plus was the result of collaboration and cooperation. It's very important, science-based, in the street documents. They're in the homepage of the Ministry of Agriculture. We're translated into English. We have the equivalent of 10,000 pages of scientific articles and papers. What are the emission and removal factors of tropical agriculture? Because for not long ago, we used the European factors, and so now our science is more robust to bring this information. And the orange one is very important, which are strategies to adapt to climate change in the Brazilian food systems. I love this picture, because when we talk about agriculture and livestock production here in Brazil, that's it. This is a rural property. I don't see only the grain production, only direct planting in the beginning of the image. I see a landscape. I can see the forestry code, in which at least 20% of the area is maintained with native vegetation. So this was the design of ABC Plus, of the new phase of ABC Plus. It's very important to look at decarbonization technologies. I'm going to present some new technologies, also connected to the forest code. So we have preservation, compliance with the legislation, combining with the adaptation and mitigation strategies. So new technologies. This is a beautiful picture. You can see the Brazilian dairy livestock. You can see the pastures, forest components, and we have a big challenge to recover these degraded pastures. How can we do it? How can we incentive these rural producers? Because they need to take this decision, and they are the protagonists of these results. To leave the left side and go to the right side of this picture. Currently, Brazil, a lot has been done. We have 74 million hectares of pastures in good conditions, but we still have 88 million hectares that has some degree of degradation. This picture in the beginning is easier. We need to control the pests and the weeds, but the severely degraded areas is not easy and not cheap to recover. So we have 15 million hectares, which is more than the planted areas, but there are 15 million hectares that has some level of degradation. So we have a big potential here to increase our production by recovering these degraded pastures. I think this is the big leverage that we have to increase Brazilian production. Some figures here. This is my area of research. It's feasible. So the degraded pasture, the cost for production is much higher for a liter of milk. It's almost the sale price of the arroba, and it's not paying the cost, or the price is not good. So what's your production costs? That's what I ask the producers. And here's some example: 220 reais per arroba. So this is some of the women that I know, and we can even lower this value with technology and sustainability. We can produce 10 times more beef or milk in the same area. This improves profitability. This is a study that we've conducted. It's not good only for the rural producers, but this measures how much of the ABC program goes back into the society. Approximately billions of reais came back to the society for the social gains of these pastures. So we do this, the integrated systems, planted forests, irrigated systems. Irrigated agriculture is a good technology for Brazil, done with appropriate handling of water, because we have, this is a map issued by ESALC, which shows the green and red, green and yellow areas are 15 million hectares that are degraded, that have the potential for irrigation. The technology that avoid emissions and ensures that we have 3 crops and more resilient production. And inputs, well, I don't even, biological fixation of nitrogen, waste treatment, methane reduction, treating the waste and diversifying the income of the producers is very important, and finishing systems. We are not using feedlots as a term because when the animals are confined and go direct to the ratio, they emit more GHG gases than animals in pastures. To avoid this 6 months, which they even lose weight during the droughts, to bring this combination, you can see the native vegetation in the back, the pastures are well managed, and termination with the trolls. So these are the new technologies. 72 millions of hectares in the next 10 years with the mitigation, not expectation. There's a calculated mitigation of 1.1 tons of CO2, of equivalent CO2. Here at the end of my presentation, I love this picture because people think, oh, it's an European animal. No, this is this crossing between Zebu and Angus is, and what we see in this picture, what is important is traceability. To have this carbon reduction, we reduce marginal costs and can add some value to the product. Here's an example of scientific basis. It's the low carbon beef when you have good pastures, or even the neutral carbon beef when you have the forestry components. Those trees are there sequestering carbon together with the pastures and are able to neutralize the emissions of the animals. So this is the picture that I took. This picture very close to Campo Grande at an integration system between the agriculture and the pasture. You can see the quality of this pasture. This is technology, increases the income for the producers, reduces marginal costs. This is sustainable livestock production. Same time of the year, the aerial photo of Brasília is not only for large cultures. We have here cocoa. So this agroforestry systems, we can hear the cocoa conciled with the preservation of native vegetation. You can see here the pasture is burned as the forest component maintains this pasture in frost periods. I like real cases. This is Santa Brígida, $50 of loss per hectare per year. And you can see the farm today, $1,400 of profit per hectare per year. And marginal production cost decrease 50% and reduced marginal costs, same area. I think the message from net zero and low carbon agriculture, the message is it's possible to produce more cheaper foods with better profitability, less inflation, and environmental conservation, looking at this rural farm as a landscape. The challenges and opportunities, I would like to emphasize three them strategies. Investment in research, and there are companies that are present here are very important for this subject. Investment in transfer of technology and rural credits, all like we're going to discuss in the future, the green bonds, financing alternatives, and so on. That's it. There you have my contact information here. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mariane. We have just heard Mariane Crespolini. He was a PhD Economic Development and former Director of the Ministry of Agriculture, Livestock and Food Supply. And before we get to Mark, let's follow the order that was established here. We will hear from Glaucia Mendes de Souza, a professor who will speak to us remotely. She's a professor at BIOEN FAPESP University of São Paulo. Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Good afternoon. Good to hear you. Where are you now? Tell us. I'm in São Paulo. You didn't want to come in person. Yeah, it wasn't possible, unfortunately. I will try to share my screen. Yes, actually, I think that everyone is already watching your presentation, so you have 20 minutes for your presentation. Thank you very much, Cassiano. Good. Let's go then. It's a huge pleasure to be here with you. I'd like to start by thanking everyone for the invitation. This is an excellent opportunity for us to disclose what the research has pointed as the way forward for the reduction of emissions and even maybe the neutralization of emissions with the use of bioenergy. I am coordinator of FAPESP's program that is called BIOEN for the research of bioenergy solutions. This program was created in 2009 and it has funded more than 300 projects. $200 million invested in research in the past 10 years. And we cover the entire field of knowledge in terms of bioenergy, biofuels, biofuel plants, and sustainability and others. BIOEN takes part of the International Agency of Energy, where I coordinate the task force for decarbonization of transportation. Brazil and Sweden are going to be the coordinators for the following 3 years, and BIOEN coordinates the activities of 2 task forces representing Itamaraty, which is the Foreign Relations Office we have in Brazil, representing the Ministry of Energy for the sustainability of bioenergy within the scope of bioeconomy. What I would like to present to you is an analysis we prepare regarding the sustainability and the potential of sustainable expansion of bioenergy in emerging countries, and emerging markets. This work is likely to be published as a paper aimed at informing public policies. It is pretty much focused on the scope of the BIOEN program at FAPESP, our institution. We began this analysis trying to integrate different methodologies to create sustainability indicators based on real data, on actual data from emerging countries. So here we put together technical and economical feasibility analysis, lifespan analysis, and here we measure the emissions, and also exergy analysis. This is a concept from thermodynamics that can be used. The destruction of energy that would be irreversible energy generation process that we could avoid, we could say. So we are expanding this scope of sustainability analysis that quite often is not very useful in our daily lives. We see often that there are many definitions of what is sustainability, trying to bring data from process engineering throughout the entire chain. To start, well, this is an analysis only regarding the south of the equator. We began to look at the expansion of bioenergy, especially in countries with large populations or developing countries that have the potential for the production of bioenergy. And in order to classify this potential, we looked at the policies enforcing these countries. And we classified them into three groups. One has policies that are fully implemented. So we have the majority of Latin America here and the southeast of Asia as well. Countries where we already have a sort of a blend mandate biofuels and fossil fuels. These are the countries shaded in green: China, India, Australia, and there are countries which have a favorable institutional environment with an established policy. However, these policies are not implemented yet. In order for us to create our database, let's keep in mind that this is a research product where we are trying to develop methodologies. We began with 4 countries that are important and represent 30% of biofuels around the world, more than 50% of the ethanol production, and 20% of biodiesel production. So Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, and Guatemala. Brazil is a leading country here when it comes to the production of ethanol in this group. It is a self-sufficient country, but has a market already established with other partners for this ethanol product, followed by Argentina. Argentina also manages to have its ethanol production. Then Colombia, that produces less than it consumes, so it has to import. And Guatemala. Guatemala is a paradoxical country because it doesn't consume, it doesn't have, so this is one of the countries that has a favorable environment, but it still has not implemented a biofuel program. It produces, but it exports all the biofuel that it produces to the US. It doesn't have an internal consumption. And in terms of biodiesel, Brazil is the largest producer in this group, followed by Argentina, Colombia, and Guatemala. Doesn't produce it. We assess it here. Both the sugar cane and corn ethanol. Here we have the routes and the several systems for the production. And In both cases, we produce biofuels and food. Talking about sugarcane, we produce sugar. And talking about corn, we produce the distillers grain. Talking about the conversion platforms for sugarcane, we have integrated production units for electric energy that is exported to the grid. In the 4 countries, talking about corn, we haven't assessed corn in Brazil, but this is a case from Argentina. They use natural gas for their processes. So, besides not exporting, they are taking it from the system, and that is reflected on the emissions. So we can see that, in average, they are quite similar in terms of emissions in comparison to gasoline, around 60% of reduction in emissions, but in the Argentinian corn, this level is reduced to 37% because they use this natural gas in their systems. Talking about biodiesel, let's remind ourselves that when we produce biodiesel, if this is a palm biodiesel as they do in Colombia, they also produce food in the form of animal feed and glycerin. In terms of soybean, they also produce food, and emissions are also huge when we look at diesel. So, looking at the emissions, all these cases that were studied, they are significantly contributing to the reduction in emissions. When we look at land use, this is a matter that is directly associated with sustainability management that we have seen throughout the years, where these biofuels can sometimes compete with food security, or they could result in the use of water that is quite excessive in these systems. We are looking into these aspects here. There is one aspect that we have not managed to look at, the social impacts. These things would require more science, more data, so that we could generate this analysis. But in general, for none of these countries, the use of land is excessive. We find significant areas in these 4 countries that are being used for pastures, followed by areas that are used in agriculture, and these very thin slices are the millions of hectares that we use for biofuels. So really, it is not due to the lack of available land. And we would even like, perhaps, to have a move similar to what we've seen in Brazil, which is the replacement of pastures by biomass production. And we have seen that in other countries because this has proven to provide several advantages. One of the matters, well, we saw a huge demand in the International Agency of Energy for studies that can demonstrate how much biomass we have, how much biomass we will be able to produce, and where. One of the options that we have observed with studies made from a global assessment of the bioenergy sustainability done in 2015, most of the lands, they are in Latin America and Africa for this expansion, and there we find a lot of extensive use of pastures that are degraded and could be recovered with the use of crops with the purpose of getting bioenergy as a byproduct, as a result. So We had some studies in Asia, including the storage of carbon in the soil and this transition between pastures to sugarcane crops, for instance. And we've seen that the payback time during this transition, from the moment you begin to use the land with sugarcane, it takes from 2 to 3 years. So that is, within this period, we are able to reduce emissions that were emitted during the transition. Then we made some calculations considering the energy efficiency of this bioenergy in these 4 countries with these biofuels. We also looked at the emissions through the lifespan analysis and the TRL, the technologies that we could perhaps start to implement now. Using the data that we got officially from governmental agencies that are sometimes even out of date, because we are looking at examples now of higher productivity levels. We would need here perhaps to convert 5% of pastures in these 4 countries to double the production of biofuels that I mentioned. Slightly more in Guatemala, slightly less in Colombia, but with 5%, give or take, we would be able to expand considerably the production of biofuels. I believe it has already been mentioned, but anyway, we have a legislation that rewards the reduction of carbon intensity in the production of biofuels in Brazil, and that is RenovaBio. We have a similar legislation in California. We have ongoing studies that are trying to look at the policies that work out well around the world, and RenovaBio is one example of that. What we did was try to transpose RenovaBio into the situation of these 4 countries, and maybe throughout 1 year the entire production of biofuels could be rewarded either for ethanol and biodiesel in these countries. And we calculate that if this ICBio, that is this decarbonization credit that is being granted for approved plants, we would be generating around $630 million for this industry in these 4 countries within 1 year. So I'd like to reiterate that, because Brazil is and has always been an example of practices in the production of bioenergy. We have technologies that are really presenting gains in terms of energy efficiency, in terms of reduction of emissions, and we finally have a policy that is rewarding these lessons that have been learned, this learning curve we have gone through that could be replicated all around the world, and we have made huge efforts to disseminate what is happening in Brazil. I'm sorry to interrupt you. I believe that you have exceeded your time. If you could just wrap up your presentation, that would be excellent. Okay, thanks for letting me know. Just to wrap up here then, showing you a little bit of this analysis that points to the areas, the points in the systems where we could interfere to improve our gains. We did this analysis of mass flow, and now these processes that I have just shown you. And now we can add a point where we could increase the efficiency. And that, for instance, could be the cogeneration of electric energy. In the case of biodiesel in Brazil, in the extraction of oil as well. So all these integrated data allow us to conclude that in these 4 countries, the bioenergy is sustainable from the energy point of view. It contributes to the reduction in emissions, and it would be feasible for us to use pastures to make this transition to quickly double our production of bioenergy. We have identified the knowledge gaps where we should be investing, and I could say that one of the points is productivity and resiliency to future climates. And we could be talking more about that if we, by chance, get time later. And I leave you with these slides, and I also thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Professor Glaucia. We will have time to talk and discuss the subject. And now I'm going to call to the floor Mark Lyra. He's the Senior Director of Sumitomo, direct from New York, here in São Paulo, Brazil. Mark, you have 20 minutes for your presentation. So Professor Glaucia went over 4 minutes, so you have, so it's a big pleasure to be here. Thanks for the organizers, Dr. Plinio, for the invitation. It's an honor to share a little bit of the ideas that we have with such an illustrious panel and with these 2 days that were so great and so interesting and brought a lot of good information and new information to everyone. So just to talk a little bit about myself before I start. As soon as I graduated from university, I moved to Hong Kong and worked at AT&T. The company was founded by Alexander Graham Bell, the inventor of telephone, and I was thinking, wow, the best seller in history of time must have worked for AT&T at the time, because imagine how difficult it was to sell the first telephone. I mean, who do they call to, right? So let's go back to this point soon, but after Hong Kong, I moved back to the United States. I worked with consultancy. Nobody's perfect, right? And then moved to Europe, worked at Nissan when we were developing the electric car. And that's when I started to realize about climate change. And my daughter was born, and I said, I'll go back to Brazil. I joined Cosan in 2008, responsible for ethanol. I was part of the team that negotiated with Shell to create Raízen. And then 2013, I came back to Cosan to start a new company for the group to use the sugarcane waste to generate pellets to export to Asia and Europe. Sumitomo Corporation became a shareholder of this business in 2016. In 2018, I joined Sumitomo in New York, now taking care of all of the part of energy transition. Sumitomo is a company of more than 400 years. They're involved with in practically all sectors of economy and in every country in the world. So I've been there for 4 years, and every day I learn some new business and some new company within the group. And one of the cool things that happened last year is that we committed to becoming a zero carbon company until 2050. We created a new business unit that is something that didn't happen in over 30 years to take care of all the sectors of the economy and all geographies in a transversal way to look for opportunities for energy transition. And we have a view on how we have the society in the future at 2050. Based on hydrogen and this convergence of different technologies. But we also have some things that we have seen at short term. And there I'll go back to the connection. So the value of the telephone that, as I mentioned in the first slide, was not being able to call everyone. And nowadays we see the same thing as how to capture value in this low carbon economy. First, you need to connect the information and share this information regarding emissions. And also we have this clear notion that you can do this transition alone, right? It's really important to engage all the stakeholders and have common language that is still lacking when we talk about emissions. Many companies and many geographies use different emission factors, so we have some challenges to overcome. We have a few messages that we need to repeat over and over again, because there's a lot of information, as we've been hearing here today, that hasn't reached where it needs to reach in terms of foreign markets, Europe, Asia, and United States. Things like, for example, our forest code is probably stricter than all other countries that we negotiate with. Of course, this is related. We need to recognize that what is missing is the implementation of this forestry code and the enforcement of this forestry code. So before we are able to have a free entrance in all markets, we really need to focus on this issue, and I think that we are will be able to do so, and we'll continue to be stricter with this law here in Brazil. I think the issue of the area available, there are few countries in the world that have so much area available, and in case of Brazil, use less than 1% of their areas, but we have 50% of the exportation of sugarcane from this small area, and a lot of fuels for the auto cycle. So it's an excellent example of something that can be expanded into other areas, into other fields, without affecting sustainability. After all, I mean, especially sugarcane, of course, other crops as well have great potential to generate waste and benefit not only food but generation of energy. But sugarcane is differentiated. It's a very efficient solar panel, and 2/3 of this energy that is captured is biomass, and which is still used with low efficiency, although it's improved in the last couple of years. As it has already been mentioned, in terms of area availability and degraded pastures, we have a huge potential to use, and not only for the expansion of agricultural areas, but for the recovery of forests as well. We have startups that are focusing on bringing resources to recover these pastures and store carbon by means of the recovery of these forests. So there's a lot of interaction on how to bring these resources to be able to really increase carbon capturing, and not only increasing the production areas as well. In Brazil, is well positioned, not due to the availability of area, but the availability of renewable water. Like Dr. Pliny mentioned yesterday, when Brazil exports soy, we're exporting water resources, renewable water resources. And when we talk about net zero waste, it's an essential thing that it's something that I personally have been focusing on the last 10 years, something that I have seen a new spirit of innovation regarding this subject in the United States. For example, we have companies that are collecting agricultural waste and transforming it in pyrolysis oil and injecting into the soil, generating credits that are sold for more than $600 a ton. Companies that transform agricultural waste to improve the quality of the soil and improve agricultural productivity, and credits that are sold for more than $500 a ton. And this waste, it can also be concentrated and exported to other countries where they have a few resources to reduce emissions. For example, in Europe and in Asia, there are highly efficient plants that were designed to burn carbon. For example, this plant generates 2 gigabytes of energy with an efficiency of 46%. An average power plant here in Brazil has an efficiency using biomass will generate 20%. So they generate 2 times more energy with the same biomass, and they run the risk of being deactivated at any moment. Sometimes after 3 or 4 years of operation, and they were built for running for 40 years, but they can maybe deactivated because some of them use coal, some were converted to biomass, but mainly wood biomass. And I think that the next phase will be to focus on the agricultural waste, because they have sustainability that is unquestionable. And it's a technology that seems something from the Flintstones, right? To burn things. But when we talk about this level of efficiency, we are talking more about the Jetsons and not the Flintstones. So burning biomass brings unique opportunities. And here are 4 scenarios of IPCC. And except the most optimistic scenario, the more realistic we go, the greater the need for using BECCS, biomass enhanced carbon capture storage. So the possibility of generating energy with biomass, of course sustainable, right? And capturing this carbon and injecting it is one of the only scale technologies that allow you to generate energy with negative emissions. And these negative emissions will be necessary for us to achieve this net zero goal. I think that there are several options, and there's no doubt we're going to need a lot of infrastructure to do so, and sometimes it seems impossible. For example, when you talk about the steel industry, the estimate is that we're going to need 200 million tons of biomass to achieve net zero only in this industry alone. In the world market today, it's approximately 40 million tons, so it's a lot of. So we need to collect all of this waste and resort, and even a lot of investments in infrastructure that we need, and it's something that is possible to do in a short period of time if the appetite and return for the investors are there. One of the issues that we faced when we talk about reducing emissions in the whole chain and achieving net zero is that today, when we talk about scope 2 and scope 3 emissions, it's really hard for companies to really differentiate and manage these issues. And again, innovation, we've been working on some projects that is called, one project that's called Carbon Prime, when we use prime data from the companies to generate emission information. All this is put into a digital platform so that we are able to combine the data of each source of emission. We had a partnership with a startup from San Francisco. We have a Brazilian CEO. This is just a coincidence. And Sinai is the name of the company. And believe that if we have an SAP for this emission data, we will be able to really use this data and communicate this data in a much more efficient way, opening doors for mitigation strategies, for validation and eventual generation of credits, and differentiation of products that were already products which had the emissions already neutralized. So we are working to have the proof of concept of this project, bringing several players along the value chain into the system and being able to allocate these emissions from each source of emission. And I'm not talking about each company, but each facility inside this company, each process inside this company, each source of emission, and from then be able to allocate this correctly. Something that you can do with Excel, right? You really need some powerful infrastructure. I hope I can share more data on this project with you, because after all, nowadays, if the consumer goes to buy something, they want to buy consciously, but it's really hard to overcome all of the marketing messages that we have for something that I've seen, for example, in the United States. People are consuming water from boxes instead of plastic bottles, with the idea that this is more sustainable. And I really don't think if this is better or worse, if there's less emissions, or if you use the box or the plastic bottle. Probably the most sustainable is to drink tap water. But I think that if we have a clear and transparent language where we can understand which emissions, how to differentiate soybean from that is carbon neutral from a soybean that is not carbon neutral, how to understand how to award these producers directly. I think that there are technologies like cyanide that can help us to achieve this. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mark. So now, Professor Glaucia, you're still with us. Can we see her on screen? Yes, I'm still here. You can hear us, right? Okay, so hearing all of you here, I'm not sure if the audience has the same impression, but we see some common points here. One of them is recovering of degraded areas, which we already mentioned. And the other point is that there are technologies, there are science that back up and allow us to gain scale, which Mark just mentioned here, like how large companies like Sumitomo with many others can, from the beginning, have this product arriving at the consumers in a more sustainable way. Starting with Mari, I would like to ask you a question. What is the biggest challenge, in your opinion, for us to be able to end deforestation, use this open areas for production, and gain scale vertically and not horizontally? It's not required. You know, we've seen it. What is the biggest challenge today to have this neutralization and make it happen? Is it credits? Do you need information for rural producers? Since it's the sector we're discussing here, do we need more incentives with this challenging market with high costs? How you make these producers choose for sustainable technology because they have high costs? What is the big challenge? Information, credit? What do you think is the big challenge? This is a very complex question, right? I mean, I think we need to think about the complexity. In this case, you're talking about people. We have 5 million rural establishments in Brazil. The average age of these producers, we're talking about more than 50 or 60 years. So when we look at this data, you told me there's a high cost. It's not a cost, it's an investment. So I don't know any rural producers that when they have access to information, and it's a complex problem, what is the size? How can we bring these technical systems and transfer this technology to these producers, right? So, okay. So when we bring this information to these producers, they're not going to adopt this technology. They're only going to adopt it if they have cash flow. So the basis for me, the foundation is research. And I think, Mark, when you show the startups, we're not going to solve the problem of the future with the technology that we have today. So the foundation is research. We need to continue innovating. So after we did this transfer, it's economic rationale. It's 50% less costs, but they need to have cash flow. And we've seen that the last Safra plans, the resources are over. So there comes the complexity again. We have a continental complex, continental country and aging producers, and we need to involve several stakeholders, not only the producers, the public power. Glaucia, would you like to comment as well? Yeah, I would like to talk about the opportunities for investment because at FAPESP we defined that um, we defined several collaboration projects with the Secretary of Infrastructure, for example, and Environment of the state of São Paulo to use waste. We already mentioned here, it was already mentioned today that this is an expanding market to try to solve the problem of urban waste, but this partnership also involves agro-industrial resources and so on. And we already financed more than 200 startups, and most of them, more than 50%, are related to the agribusiness. These are students that are entrepreneurs as well, are developing projects in this field, developing new products with biomass, a lot of technology involved, a lot of information technology for the agribusiness. We've been seeing this movement of the agribusiness becoming greener, using biomethane, biofuels. So I think there are a lot of opportunities for investment, and FAPESP has been working with these partnerships. So I believe that we can expand this base at short term. Mark, you have experience abroad, and for a Brazilian to be living abroad for so many years, to see Brazil exporting an image that is not it's not compatible with the reality. What is your perception? What do you think that we need to do abroad? If you want to comment on my first question as well, but I'd like you to talk about your experience abroad and how Brazil can reverse this image and attract investments, especially in such a difficult year with escape of capitals and war and so on. How can Brazil solve this question about its image and bring investments to this important sector for the world? Well, there's no doubt that Brazil plays an important role in this new geopolitical game that is being played. We have great opportunities, and I think that above all, the issue of deforestation is what we really need to focus on. If you don't demonstrate that we're in a good pathway, it's going to be really difficult. There are also a lot of misinformation abroad, but this is something that I think it's not as persistent as some facts. So I think that this is one point that the Brazilian people really need to put pressure on the governments, because if we don't solve this issue, it's going to be difficult to enter into these markets. Of course, considering the proportions, the world, at the end of the day, needs our products. We have one of the main flows here, and Brazil must be included in this market. But to be a great exporter of renewable carbon credits and so on, all this criteria must be considered so that we can change this image. Can I just make a comment, Cassiano? Excuse me, can I just make a comment on this issue of deforestation? We've been doing some analysis that shows that approximately 200 to 300 millions of CO2 have been avoided by the forestry code. We've been doing a photographic analysis with the satellite images. We increased the forest coverage in the sugar sector and alcohol sectors. We're focusing on bioenergy, but it's important to disclose this because we talk a lot about what we haven't done, but some things we have done, and we have done them correctly. And the forest code has really helped us to reduce some emissions. Yes, there's no doubt about that. Since we're talking about recognition. The forestry sector does some great work in terms of preservation and conservation for long years, way before the forest code. But I'd like to talk about technology, transfer of technology. You're rural producer. Do you think that the technology of transfer, knowledge and information are the main points to show that this is feasible? Do you think that this information is arriving at the fields, or the lack of connectivity? What prevents the producers from having access to these technologies and making things happen in practice? Yes, I think that we need to go to the properties. I mean, connectivity. There's properties, some lands that are 5 kilometers from the next city, and they don't have any 3G or 4G connection. My husband is doctor in pasture management. We went into a new region, a degraded area, and I think it's beautiful to see how the neighbors are looking for us. What are we doing? We're recovering pastures, doing supplementation for the animals. The best goal was one of my employees that he said, with this high production cost, they're investing in supplementation, in genetics. And my employee said, wow, I always see you with the computer and you're doing some math that looking at my neighbors, why didn't they never do it? Because it never arrived to them. They don't have access to this information. If they have this information, I'm pretty sure that half of them, they don't have the cash flow to do it. So they're surviving, they're paying their bills. And their other investments, their rural credits and PRONAF, they adopt the technology. So they really need this help. An example of this are the figures of the ABC program. The general goal of the ABC program was improving producer income. And this is very positive, but it needs to arrive there, it needs to get there, and the companies have an important role to play in this field. The input industries, they go to this 5 million rural establishments. They need to go there. No, I agree 100%. I believe that one of the challenges is not only generating this value in the value chain, but ensure that this arrives to the producers so they can incentive good practices. And just to give you an example, in the automotive industry, the premium for designing a neutral carbon car is approximately 5% of the value of the car if it could arrive at the source. And the same thing happens with agriculture. I mean, if you're at the market or a restaurant, that premium will not get to the consumers. So that's why technology and innovation, using blockchain, for example, can allow to assure this. Professor Glaucia would like to make any comment. I want to ask you a question. No, not regarding this question. If you want to ask another one, good. Okay, what I would like to know from you is from green hydrogen. Everybody's talking about green hydrogen. Like today, they talk a lot about it here. They talk a lot here in Brazil. What is the potential for green hydrogen? What do you think about other sources? We talk about sugar and ethanol. There are other alternatives that support bioenergy, right? People are talking about production of ethanol from wheat. This is something new, right? Some genetics companies. How do you see this? Well, first of all, I think that there's a local context that need to be considered. Bioenergy you do with local biomass, with local, with agricultural waste and industrial waste, but the farther away you are, you have to go to collect your biomass, the lower your emission reduction and greater your costs. So I think that each location will have to think about their own advantage, and we have to see how the several Brazilian states are going to move forward with this subject. We have projects in and the Amazon to decarbonize river transportation of products, biofuels for aviation. We have a call for projects for bioenergy, for long distance transportation. So there are endless possibilities. There are different biomasses that can be used. I think that Brazil has the DNA that is strong, and in consequence, we have a lot of biomass that can be explored. And there's one issue that is important, that I believe that sustainability also goes through the generation of diversified technological possibilities and portfolios and of products. So we have different products regarding biorefinery, which are able to capture CO2 for the production of compounds. So there's capture and sequestration of for use and for biomaterials as well. So the possibilities, the technological possibilities are limitless, and I believe that for these TRLs that are these levels of maturity that are lower, we need to really try to stimulate the basis of this pyramid to open new opportunities for young entrepreneurs, because this is what what I've been mentioning, opportunities to submit these projects for small companies to be able to do this research. I think this is important, and this will allow us to leverage these projects for the long term, for the medium or long term. But at short term, I believe that we need to exploit this biomass sources by creating hydrogen and biogas. From the biogas, you're able to do biomethane, going back to hydrogen. From biomethane, you can produce hydrogen, and when you have this hydrogen, you can use it for transforming into stationary applications. So, for example, you can eventually have transformation of ethanol into hydrogen. In this reform process, or you can, from biomethane, create ammonium, green ammonium, which is also another option for our dependency for fertilizers. And this green ammonium can be used on board and can be transformed for maritime transportation, creating this hydrogen on board. So there are several technological areas that we have been seeing, several applications within planes and airports for using hydrogen, and these are becoming essential because there's a lot of uses, and there's now we need to the electrolysis, which we still have a line to wait for buying this equipment to do electrolysis.
That's right. I think that we have reached the end of our time. It's been 1 hour and a half that we've been talking, but I couldn't even notice. I hope that we can see each other in person. Thank you very much, Professor, for your contribution. I hope that you have great success in your research. And it's also great to have Mark and again his participation. And we carry on with our schedule. Thank you very much.